As this part of the book is substantially different to what has gone before, there are some things you should know. The first and most important of these is that this is a meditation on the relationship between life and death. However, while my program recognizes that a non-material portion of ourselves continues to exist in some form beyond death, this is not the focus of my writing. As such, dying is not only important because it marks the end of the physical body, but because it represents the transition of a non-physical aspect of being to its final resting place. Further to this, you should know that my observations are not based on any existing religion or philosophy. Rather, they are based on my willingness to lean into what I experience as a capacity for knowing. And finally, you should know that this book wrote me. I don't mean in the sense that it was somehow easy or that it changed me, but is related to how the fact of the book having been written in my future caused me to make decisions that were conducive to its having been completed. For fundamentally, it is my impression that life is lived backwards, and that our lives are strongly affected by our capacity to sense events occurring around us in our future. The basis for this thinking is a consideration of that non-physical aspect of being that we can't see, but whose absence characterizes a corpse. This non-physical aspect of ourselves is something that I call light. Everyone is born with light, and you can't get rid of it. It's just there, like arms and legs. To introduce this concept, and if you are sitting comfortably, then I ask you to enter into a thought experiment. Imagine, if you will, a flower. Held in your hand, it will likely be composed of a stem, on which there may be leaves, and some petals. Now, thinking about how the stem and petals form a thing called a flower, imagine that you, the physical person, are a stem, and all around you is a non-material structure made of petals. As with the flower, this non-material structure is not somehow separate to your physical body. In fact, it is entirely derived from it. Thinking now about light, we can see first how the physical body provides the architecture for the existence of the non-material structure. This then provides the logical basis for how we, as sentient beings, can engage in activities that will enhance or diminish the quality of our life. You might reasonably ask then, how is this light shaped? The answer to this is as simple as it is logical. We shape our light through our actions. Imagine, if you will, that each of your actions contributes a little packet of light that gets lodged in or distributed around your own superstructure. And this superstructure is in turn shaped by the existence of completed superstructures that have become detached from bodies after death. I may be getting ahead of myself here, but these superstructures that do this shaping are best characterized by their robust crystalline structures. These light superstructures become detached at the time of death and subsequently did not change. They remained, and their presence contributes to the possibility of shaping everyone else's light. The main feature that I have observed, and that I think is of significance to ordinary everyday life, is that the light you are born with is already imprinted with all the experiences of your life. By this I mean that everything that happens to you in real physical life is imprinted as a packet of experience that is lodged in your life. The reason this is possible is because light is non-material. It exists outside the time that defines our corporeal world. However, beyond this, light contributes to a pump-like mechanism by which the non-material aspects of dead people are reintegrated into a light superstructure. It may strike you as not particularly pleasant, but the non-material aspects of every one of us, our light, is a sort of highway for the light that has become detached from people after their death. And whilst I have referred elsewhere to these people as ancestors, because the act of restoration is a sort of universal, this traversing light is not limited to people you know. And in fact, when you think about it, and I think this is something that you must do, what are your expectations? For example, when I refer to these people as ancestors, this is a metaphor. These ancestors are not people who sit around some campfire with you after death. Rather, ancestors is a word that indicates a state of existence at a particular time. In fact, I contend that this state of existence is a threshold that you have the possibility of attaining after death. And from this threshold, you may be reborn. Now, what I have described here is a general tendency. For, as you might imagine, there is a range of variables that affect how this works. For example, if you, at the time of your death, have little light, then you will have difficulty in being restored to the great light superstructure. In this instance, your non-material self relies on those who have much light to overcome the inertia that your state of unlightness prompts. Perhaps you can sense now what this narrative is moving towards. A discussion about how sentient beings can manipulate their own light so as to be of service to others. In fact, this manipulation is the basic premise of this book, that a greater degree of service can be achieved through a remaking of our relationship to nature. This can only be achieved through embracing non-violence. What non-violence means is that every interaction must be rooted in a commitment to not do harm. This might sound simple. After all, people generally think of themselves as nice and kind, and even without the capacity to deliberately harm another person. But the problem is that any action that has at its core a profound disrespect of another will lodge in your light and negate the possibility for it to be fully transformed. Many of you by now will think that this all sounds quaint, but does it apply to me? I have news for those people who think that the fact of having lived an ordinary life is in any way sufficient. For to have a light that will sufficiently transform to allow you to be reunited with your ancestors, you must do much better than the assertion of blamelessness. Indeed, unless you spent the whole of your life putting the interests of others at least on par with your own, then the best that you can aim for is a marginal improvement in the overall quality of your life. But what does this mean, putting the interests of others at least on par with your own? It means not treating people as a means to an end, not for any reason, whether it be through the ordinary course of commerce, a need for self-advancement, or simply because you championed a religion or belief that allowed you to maintain that you were in some way more entitled to the goods you desired. Dying is, in fact, a whole life program. You cannot start early enough. Now, to answer a question of how is light transformed? Your light is transformed when you deliberately reshape it according to the principle of non-violence. This reshaping is not concentrated on one event, but is distributed across the entirety of interactions you have had with other people. The purpose of this reshaping is not, therefore, to supply an alternative history, in other words, to revise the events of the past, but to consider deeply how those events might contribute to a new program of nonviolence. However, a program of remaking nature cannot catapult you beyond the errors of your lifetime. It can only increase the overall quality of your life. As you might imagine, this alteration of how experiences are distributed across your lifespan is profoundly relative. In other words, an action that you contemplate from your hospital bed may seem insubstantial to an outsider, but may be highly significant for you. And this is why I suggest that the program of nonviolence you must engage in is simply one of starting conversations. And whilst it might seem unfair to burden you with the task of engaging in a radical program of nonviolence, I ask you to listen further. For this book encourages you to make peace with the past. This is not so much permission to absolve yourself of guilt or to turn your back on wrongdoing. Rather, it is an invitation to actively shape the present in full knowledge that the past cannot be undone. And because dying brings with it the acute realization that the problems of the past cannot be solved through rumination, you must acknowledge that your life will not be transformed through regret. Rather, I entreat you to have courage and use the principle of nonviolence to remake nature. So I turn now to the question of what is nature and how can it be remade? The basis for my thesis that nature can be remade is a theme in social science that nature is a social construct. That is, that we collectively engage in practices that reproduce a set of ideas about a thing called nature. Of course, not everything is a social construct, and social scientists refer to these as social facts. But to a large degree, most of how we think about nature is anchored in social norms. This sounds all very well in theory, but you might ask, what does this actually mean, and how can I relate it to my experience? So in answer to this question, I invite you now to find a space in which you can observe your thoughts. Close your eyes and think of a leaf. What leaf do you see? Is it close enough that you can describe it? Take a breath and think about what you see. I'm not good at visualizing objects, but if I try very hard, then when I close my eyes, the leaf I imagine is from a beech tree, and what strikes me about it first is its colour. For this is a leaf in spring. In my hand, the leaf is bright green, and I see its outline as somewhat oval. It has a spine down the middle, and in holding it, I can feel the roughness of its reverse. It feels like the centimetre markings on a ruler. Now set aside the leaf and think of a tree. What tree do you see? When I think of a tree, it is something I'm looking up at. Only it's not any one tree. What I see is the idea of a tree. For some reason, the way I perceive a tree is fundamentally different to how I see the leaf. For whilst I could hold the leaf firmly in my hand, the idea of a tree is ever-changing. It's like I don't really know what a tree is. But still, fundamentally, when I think of that thing that is tree, I'm looking up at the same spring green with sunshine behind it. How do you see this tree? Is it from the same family or type as the leaf you saw? Is there one tree in your imagination that defines all trees? Then I see a wood. What I mean by a wood is a place defined by the existence of many trees. For example, the wood I see is a pine forest, of the kind that were planted by national bodies in the area where I grew up. This wood is dark green and doesn't let in much light. And I see it at a distance and from a higher vantage point, as you would see a landscape behind you as you climbed a hill. I don't have the same feeling about this view as I did when considering a leaf or a tree. This is because the scale and perspective of this wood combine in some way to exclude me. As a result, I can quite carefully define what wood is, but somehow it is beyond me. The point of asking you to think in this way about a leaf, a tree, and a wood is that it shows, if you didn't already know, that we draw on a very great range of factors when constructing our ideas of nature. However, what is important about this is that it shows how there is no nature which is separate from the way we see it. The reason that this is important is because the task of remaking nature, according to the principle of nonviolence, requires us to not just consider carefully the factors that go into the way we produce an idea of nature, but then to reassemble them in a way that prioritizes our relationship with each other. Let me explain. So in this section, I want to explain how nature is not separate from the way we see it. When thinking about the factors that contribute to how we construct our idea of nature, language is a great place to start. For example, what were the words that you used to describe the leaf that you held in your imagination? And if you have more than one language, were those words from your first language? Think for a while about how the language you use might affect the way you experience the leaf. For example, as English is my first language, if I reflect at all on the sound of the name beach, then it is only to remember the joke of how this beach sounds the same as the beach at the seaside. And whilst this is a fun game to play with children, it really doesn't affect the way that I think about the leaf. This is because I know in my head that the sound or thought of a beech leaf or tree reproduces a certain pattern of meaning. What I mean by this is that the use of a particular word draws you into a web of meaning making that the words beech leaf or beech tree code. In this, I'm thinking of how this beech tree is also known by its Latin name, Fagus sylvatica. Now, whilst I know a few Latin names because I'm interested in the history of plants, before I wrote this chapter, I didn't actually know the Latin name for a beech tree. Many people will. And for many of these people, learning the Latin name was just part of learning what the plant is. This is because for them, how they experience that part of nature is not separate from the process by which it is coded into scientific knowledge. Perhaps you have a different experience of meanings that are coded into the names for the leaf or tree of your imagination. For example, one of your languages might reflect the season in which the leaf was being viewed. If this is the case, then make a note in the margin about the range of norms that are communicated through the process of naming. And whilst I would like to write more about the process by which language and culture contribute to how societies construct their relationships with nature, I think your time is better used by starting your own conversations about remaking nature. However, my final thought is that in doing so, you must also reflect on how this process of placemaking is itself an inadequate basis for remaking nature. This is because the processes by which we come to cherish aspects of our lives, including nature, may be inconsistent with the principle of nonviolence. For example, the beech leaf of my Irish childhood imagination is entirely and properly foreign to the habitat of my adopted home, Australia. Planting beech trees in Australia is not an act of wonder. It is the perpetuation of a settler mentality that is itself predicated on the violent disruption of Indigenous people from their lands. In conclusion, I offer the consideration of why it is that the conscious remaking of nature is an appropriate means by which one might transform one's life. Why not encourage prayer, acts of devotion, or some kind of penance? The reason for this is that the intention to remake nature has at its heart an acknowledgement that human history is a complex interweaving of interactions with each other. And so our light is not inscribed with aspirations or dreams, but rather is a mosaic of our entire life's interaction with other people. This gives rise to what I call the distributed self. Not a self that is performed at one time in one place, but a self that is composed of unceasing interaction with other people's light. Through this continuous interaction of our non-physical selves, a reality of timeless and formless possibility emerges. And just as with the process of remaking nature, the task of reshaping our light is impossible without first considering how our actions affect other people, and in turn through consideration of how the events that shape another person's light then affect our own.